Welcome to Tactical Faith. I'm Matt Burford. Man, I am here today with one of my great friends. We've had him on before. When it comes to my gut and intuition, which guides me a lot with what I do with Tactical Faith, I've said it before. A friend of mine says, you just go by whatever you ever find interesting. And he's probably right. God has guided my intuition throughout the years, in a lot of success has come from it. But in this particular instance, I think God guided an Amazon algorithm to show me a book called The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis by a young guy. Can I still call you a young guy? I mean, at your age, you're still young relative
I
to.
think so. I'm
I think
42.
I
Does that
think so
count?
too. Sure. Dr. Jason Baxter, who since that fateful day that Amazon decided to gift me with that book suggestion, I have reached out and become a great friend to. He has been a great friend to me. We just had him here in October of 2024 to pair with Paul Kingsnorth and Rod Dreher to talk about some fun things. But just as an intro, again, he's a college professor and author of 7 books, including what I just mentioned, Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis. And in December, he has a book that I just got to read a little bit of. It's called Why Literature Still Matters. He's a medievalist who specializes in things like Dante, and he's got a new translation of Dante out, which is really great. I used in my class this last fall. And of course, he specializes in C.S. Lewis. You can find now his popular writing in a new Substack called Beauty Matters, which he has a few posts in now that are really good. And we'll explore that a little bit. But he does himself look at the intersection of literature, spirituality, technology, the arts, and the relevance to old books. So thanks, Jason, for coming on.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for the
Hey,
invitation.
let's just get right into it. You have a new book coming out called Why Literature Still Matters, Beauty After the Apocalypse.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit why you decided to write this and why now.
Yeah. Well, the subtitle "Beauty After the Apocalypse" is sort of suggestive of the urgency of the project. I'd also thought about doing something even more provocative, like uh, "Read while you still can" or something like that.
You're right.
But yeah, no, this is a book about why literature still matters. It's particularly a book about why reading old books, what we could call great books, is particularly urgent, but it's also about the difficulties of reading them in our age. It's about what it's like to live in a technological age, and borrowing from C.S. Lewis here, in which we've now spent so much more time around our machines that machine metaphors have gotten into our vocabulary and thus control our emotions and control how we feel about the world. And what happens when that becomes sort of the sunk paradigm, as Charles Taylor calls it, when it gets so much into our kind of cosmic imaginary that our ancestors' books feel strange and slow and, dare I say it, boring. And but it's not, it's not them, it's us. And so this book is about why they still matter. It's a book which also gives some advice about how to escape those initial misimpressions. And it was a ton of fun to write. It goes from Mark Zuckerberg to Homer to Lewis and J.D. Salinger and Wilbur and other poets. And yeah, it was been a delight to do.
Yeah, the first question that you asked though is what does literature feel like? Not what do you think about, but you use this emotive language like feel. Why did you say that?
Yeah, I think because part of what part of my argument, especially in chapter 3, which I call "Down the Rabbit Hole," is this developing of Lewis's idea of not just the mechanization of the world picture, but you could say almost the psychological mechanization of the soul, in which I spent a little bit of time with Jeremy Bentham and his experiments with panopticon, of trying to create these rationally perfect places which again, and this is just sort of like machine think, in which we could, through a method, through a perfect rational grid, gain almost total control over our environments and
Mm.
exert our will upon nature. And at some point in the Enlightenment, this type of, you could call it, machine think, gets out of the academies and gets out of the salons where it had been these, types of sort of imaginative games, and begins to actually get into communities, and begins to shape our lives and to shape our external environments, right? It's what we call the Enlightenment, right? The attempt to sort of to take the methodology of the scientific revolution and apply it to controlling human spaces and human interactions, right? So this is kind of the, the long experiment, which we're now the heirs of, but which is, maybe found as sort of apotheosis, its consummation, right, in our age of sort of digital technologies, in some sense. So I jokingly say, jokingly, it's not very funny, that that Jeremy Bentham um, and other sort of founders of the Enlightenment are the grandfathers of our own cultural heroes, of Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, that they've now sort of brought into a perfection. And if I'm right about that, then what it means is that we have this methodology, this kind of machine-like thinking. We think in terms of a grid. We sort of plot our inputs over against our outputs as if we're sort of mapping everything in a two-dimensional space of an XY axis. If that's what, kind of who we are and how we think, oftentimes without even knowing it, if we live in the world of what some scholars call the datification of the self, in which we're constantly quantifying our lives, and we're measuring our heartbeats and counting our steps and testing our sleep, and sort of think of ourselves secretly as computers, as Shirley Turkle wrote in her first book, Second Self, then this is why literature still matters. And
Mm.
because literature has this sense of embodiment, this sense that it doesn't just need a grid, it doesn't reduce the world to mathematical applications, or sort of, to the algorithm, but it has this rich sense of embodiment, of almost kind of incarnational living, in which it touches not just my brain, but it touches my whole being. It touches my body. It touches my emotions. It touches my nerves. It touches my pulses. Right. Literature is, like with the other arts, as I jokingly put it, using one of these metaphors I critique, our ability to download and not to stream. Right. Literature is
Mm.
the ability to close the gap between the beauty which I see and the person I am within. And that's why I think you're thinking in my chapter, How to Die in Sardinia. That's why I use these rich sort of questions of what does it feel like to read literature. And thus, I also sort of draw on some of my own travel experiences of being immersed in a landscape, and having that sort of full-bodied, rich encounter as our best analogy for what it actually feels like to read literature, and thus what it's good for.
Yeah. So, do you think there's been a net loss when we cease to interact with these ancient writings from a pure, almost like literary book form? I mean, I know enough that about this world to think, was there a net loss when we moved from being a listening culture to a reading culture? As I speak in, especially next semester, I deal with Reformation to modern when it comes to these ancient texts. I'm often kind of have to stop myself and think, well, man, what happened when we went from dissipating and promoting and communicating an oral culture to a written culture? Have you thought about that? Like, do these ideas take a different kind of feel to them when they're promoted via orally, and you have to listen intently, incarnationally, in community, as opposed to individual encountering a written book?
That's such a cool question. I think you want to take it all the way back to the second half of Plato's Phaedrus, and I think so. I mean, Plato already is wonders when you begin to do philosophy as if it's merely a set of correct opinions. Have you already lost something? And he thinks that you have. He thinks that there's something about the give and take of dialogue, in which through looking and looking around the issue, all of a sudden someone sees it. I mean, his favorite term for that is all of the suddenness. It's exiphanes. Frequently throughout the dialogue, someone sees something and it happens all of a sudden. And Plato seems to think that the best place for that to happen is in the midst of an ongoing friendship, an ongoing, serious, ennobling friendship in which there's this vigorous dialogue until people come all of a sudden upon the truth. And I think what he's getting at behind that is, as one of my friends once put it, every true statement should be followed by an exclamation point and a question mark, right? If it's really true, it should come with almost a sense of wonder. Can it really be this? Is it such as this? Can there anything really be? And then the exclamation point, in some sense, comes and says, not only sort of, enacts this element of praise, then it is true, right? But also has this type of ethical imperative. As the poet Rilke says, when we see beauty, we say within our hearts, now everything must change. I think Plato, in his own sort of discussion of the dangers of book learning, right, almost sort of anticipates us and sees us that at some point people will think that education is mere downloading of kilobytes to, which one worker gives another worker, the potential to contribute to the GDP, as opposed to the sort of this process of what Lewis calls being inducted into a community of just sentiments, in which what I see in my mind, I also hold with my heart.
Mm.
So I think you could look at our whole sort of culture of kind of quote unquote media studies and see that you both have this type of this movement toward the literary, this movement type toward the textual, this movement towards the logical and the precise. Um, with when you go from sort of Homer's culture of these chanted poems, right? These sung poems, which were memorized and sort of passed on in chunks to future generations, to a more philosophical, geometrical culture like Plato's. But then you have these moments in which, say if you think of sort of medieval scholars and medieval monks who are adding interlinear notes and adding neumes, these Gregorian notes, and adding these decorations to the margins and these diagrams. It's as if the monks were in some sense almost trying to go backwards. The black writing on the text were like furrows in the soil. The soil had been sort of plowed up, and ideas had been planted in them, but they weren't really alive until they had taken on song, when they had been translated from mere ideas into a sense of praise, into a sense of flourishing and flowering within the imagination. So I think you could see these two poles of the precise and the literate, and um our very textual, bookish types of culture, but also this desire to put the finger in, close the book, and then have it become embodied in a life, embodied in a heart, as mutually cross-pollinating activities, which we really need both of them at the same time. And it just sort of depends on what age of culture we live in which we have to have self-knowledge, of which we need more.
Yeah. So you contrast Mark Zuckerberg's letter to his son Max, right? Uh,
Daughter,
his daughter Max. That's right. Sorry. So his daughter
Maxima.
Max, with like Yeats, right? If I remember correctly from reading it.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. That's the
Um,
opening chapter.
but so I did a little experiment with myself because, and I'll let you kind of describe it a little bit. But the letter to Max, I just read it aloud because
Good.
I wanted to hear what it sounded like just reading it aloud, right? As opposed to reading the poem that you also were kind of comparing it to. It even sounded different, if that makes sense. Like the argument that you make, which I'll let you make the argument in a second. The argument that you were making, the overall argument, I think was just as powerful instead of reading it, saying it out loud, right? And it
Mm,
seemed, and I don't want to take away from what your answer is to my question here,
mm,
but it even Zuckerberg's letter seemed flat
mm.
compared to saying something else deeper. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
It almost read
Yeah.
as a corporate letter for marketing. Because I've been in the business development world, I know what that sounds like. I know what that
Right.
looks like. But even saying those things out loud sounds corporate, sounds polished, sounds stretched thin, seems to be made for the masses, smallest, the largest common denominator, those kind of things.
Yeah, like
I,
something C.S. Lewis's characters Gumpus would have asked one of
yes,
his clerks to write up. Yeah,
absolutely.
I have charts. I have data, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what it felt like. So take us there
Yes.
for a minute. Why use his letter to his daughter
Mm.
to make your argument?
Yeah, I love this. Well, I mean, for me, the origin of this was similar to what you've just described. I would bring this letter in and I'd read it aloud to my students.
Huh.
And I would try not to prejudice their thoughts about it. I would just read it. And something very paradoxical emerged because you'd think that what we ought to do is praise Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan as these great cultural heroes. In some sense, they have all the right answers. They pledge to give 99% of their Facebook shares away, right? To combat inequality and global poverty. And they say all the right things. And then they utter things, sentiments that of course every parent knows. And you think that, what kind of cretin doesn't get excited about, who wouldn't believe in saying, we're so proud of you. You give us
Right.
hope for the future. We want your life to be better than ours. These seem like these, in some sense, if you listed all these opinions, no one could possibly disagree with them. And so the fascinating thing is, why is it that students who know that they're hearing all the right ideas are left completely cold by it? Why do they, why are not they not moved by this thing? And in order to get at that question, I
Mm,
thought, okay, why don't I use my literary training, which is, more comfortable with Homer and Dante than contemporary culture. But why don't I just sort of use my literary training and do, a proper literary analysis of Zuckerberg? But before I do that, I go back to 100 years before and go to W.B. Yeats' poem, "A Prayer for My Daughter."
mm,
And in that thing, we look at all these wonderful metaphors that Yeats feels that he has to use. And what I ultimately sort of develop and compare and contrast is that Yeats feels that he needs to use the whole book of the world, right? All of these symbols. He needs myths, he needs towers, he needs monsters, he needs birds, he needs trees and flowers and history. He needs all these things in some sense to wish this sort of symphony, or if you prefer, you want to change the metaphor, this whole ecosystem of goods and virtues and loves that he knows that human flourishing needs to be. His favorite image is a tree full of singing birds, particularly the linnet. That's a flourishing human soul for him.
mm,
When you have that in mind, and then go back and read the Zuckerberg, and you go with a highlighter in hand and highlight all of his metaphors, well, come to find out, what you find is his favorite metaphor, not surprisingly, are the maxima. His daughter's name is Max, and the minima of applied functions, right? Those places where the derivatives go to zero, and thus thus that these are where the market opportunities exist. And so when you think of the encyclopedic breadth, the symphonic and harmonic quality that Yeats wishes to give his daughter, the emotional complexity that he understands the soul, and compare it to how simplified and unreal, and we've already said it, how flat it is. You sort of feel like Mark Zuckerberg is trying to reduce the conditions of human flourishing to a two-dimensional XY axis.
mm,
And thus for him, essentially, is happiness means greater productivity. Whereas for Yeats, happiness means this type of richly embodied flourishing. And that was a really fun thing to do, because Yeats, when you compare them, then you realize, and it's a little terrifying to do, you realize how much we've lost. And you realize, almost with a sort of sense of trepidation, this is where the apocalyptic stuff comes in. That the scariest thing about the letter is not that Yeats sort of thinks of his daughter's life as a graph in which he hopes to see exponential increase, and not just velocity, but acceleration. The scariest thing is that he doesn't seem to know there's an alternative to it. And that's where, part of the sense of urgency of this project comes, right? As Lewis once joked, at least before we reject it, we need to know what we're rejecting.
Mm, wow. There's so much to go there. I guess my mind is drawing me back for some reason to when, Jesus and John basically said, eat of my flesh and drink of my blood, in such a weird phrase. And the disciple says, "This is," he asked the disciples, "Is this too hard?" I mean, why?
Mm,
Because they're like, "This is a hard teaching. How can we accept it?" Um, Jesus
mm,
is always using this complicated language that's anything but flat. It's the most robust language that you could
that's right. Yeah, I like
to
that.
to communicate deeper, and I don't even want to say harder things. I would just say deeper things. And one of the things that I've been, I guess, being blessed with the ability to teach in this Cortex kind of great books program, and maybe you're alluding to it as well, is this deep, rich tradition to use language in such a way that seems like Jesus saying flesh and blood language. And my students who are freshmen in college are like, I don't know what to do with this. It's too hard. Like, I don't even know how to start. Right. And I have to assume they don't even, by the end of the semester, they're not even reading some of the stuff. Right. Because the chasm between where they are and where these authors are so large that they almost give up. Right. So, and this brings me back to even your translation of Inferno, how difficult it is to translate something in a vernacular but not lose the beauty, right? Uh,
Yes.
which for those who are listening to this, I would urge you to go get Dr. Baxter's translation of Inferno, because you do a really good job of keeping the heart without stripping it and flattening it.
Mm,
But I'll make a note here, and then I'll toss you a question or two. Maybe you have a comment. Um, the hardest part of my semester has been we are now to Shakespeare, and I gave a sonnet briefly. We looked at two sonnets, one about the youth, the beauty of youth, and then one about the beauty of old age. And I'm taken back by the fact that young women do not like the idea of a man courting them with poetry. That Gen Z sees poetry as something that's icky, that's something that just sounds fake. And I don't know what to do with that. But I think after reading your first chapter, and I can't wait till I get the book, the urgency is losing somebody's ability to see the world in a deep and meaningful way. And I'm telling you, I have three classes, 75 students, majority are young women. Young women are showing me that they cannot understand wooing and and for a young man to pursue them in a poetic, deep way. And on the other end, I think they desire it, right? Because they're made in God's image. And, when we went through Beatrice and Dante, they didn't understand what Dante was trying to say by making Beatrice this object of beauty. And if you don't know that, then you even don't know the extra step he took by saying even she couldn't take him to the highest sphere. As beautiful as she was, God's even more beauty, right? So there's a net loss here, and maybe I'm starting to get the urgency you're talking about, where we're no longer having the capacity to see and understand the world in a deep, real way.
yeah. A million cool things there. Um, I hear eating and I hear the eternal feminine, and so I'll just address both of those. But yes, that is my favorite metaphor for what the experience of beauty is like, and thus what the experience of literature should be like. Is that it's not just, I say in the book that, I say in the Substack and Beauty Matters, that I don't, the experience of beauty is haunting because I don't just want to see it, I want to eat it. I don't just want to see beauty, I want to become beauty. And that, as Lewis says, that one of the sort of shocking aspects of the experience of beauty is that it always comes with this slight note of sorrow. And he suggests that the sorrow is because I perceive this gap, and thus the very sort of artistic drive, you could say the drive shaft, to use another mechanized metaphor, the very drive shaft of art is to try to preserve that moment of beauty as well as to sort of close the gap. And so I think this whole idea of eating, this idea of or even sort of sacramental eating playing out in a liturgical situation is a really potent metaphor for what knowledge, for how we could think of knowledge
Mm.
as the sort of permanent acquisition in the very marrow of my, it changes your sort of your spiritual DNA, you could shape, right? It shapes your affections, it shapes your hungers, and probably in a good way even shapes your repulsions, right? Or you over the course of time, one hopes, as you begin to to lose those sort of sick and sallow attractions which you know that you shouldn't have, and begin to develop this healthier hunger. I think that's the whole sort of process of the thickening up process, which could happen through good art, that happens in a good encounter of beauty. At least that's, we never perhaps get there fully, but that's where we're going. So I love the metaphor of eating and develop that a little bit in the book. I think this other thing, I don't really do as much of this in the book, but I do think this whole idea of the feminine is super interesting, and I think it's relevant to our conversation. I mean, and it's not just chauvinistic chauvinistic men who would say this, but even some really interesting feminist scholars would suggest that the whole kind of movement of feminism in the past couple of decades has been this one in which a secret type of masculine chauvinism has been the controlling background logic of even the feminist movement. That is that in some sense, by women have conformed themselves to these, traditionally masculine, machine-like metaphors of productivity functions. Even Kingsnorth has written about this in some of his recent stuff. But in some sense, been a little bit of a trick in that the trick of the machine, and that women have been liberated, but they've been liberated from their spaces of the home in order to be better cogs and functions of the machine, right? Is Rosie the riveter freer than the stay-at-home mom? Only if she has the right to choose one or the other, right? But I think this whole sort of aspect of trying to conform both men and women to the sort of productivity function of the machine is fascinating, because what it means is that we've lost a sense of of what some scholars call the eternal feminine, right? Not just biologically female, or sort of biologically woman, but the spiritual value to which that points toward, right? And if we lose that, then it's not just women who lose access to it, but it's men as well. That and at least for me, sort of part of the magic of the final of the end of Dante's comedy is that this male poet who's had to use his words to write about feminine beauty now walks into the presence of God. And he sort of looks into this wonderful sort of like black hole, what he thinks is a black hole of being at first. And out of it emerges a face, a kind of iconic face of Christ, what you could even call a Mandelian or Shroud of Turin face of Jesus, emerges out of the depths of God and looks at him. Now, all of a sudden, this male poet who had been writing about, the beauty of a face now becomes that beautiful object which is now being contemplated. Dante has to let himself be seen. Dante has to let himself be loved. Dante becomes the beloved. And in the medieval ages, right, in this kind of like traditional sort of feminine role, Dante becomes the loved object and lets himself have to be loved, even in his ordinariness, even in his simplicity. And I think that is at least one of the sort of mysteries of the eternal feminine, is that to you know to gain legitimate authority over things can be a good thing, right? To increase our power over the world within measure, and prudence can be a good thing. But if we begin to think that the sole purpose of being human, the sole purpose of our engagement with the world is power and control, then in some
Mm.
sense, what's evaporated this capacity to even be loved, the capacity to let myself be loved. And thus, I mean, I suspect that even even in your students' difficulty with Dante, and even if there's sort of difficulty with Shakespeare, there might be something really interesting going on. And it's what I call in the book the mechanization of the world picture, but also the mechanization or the psych, the mechanization of the human psyche is that these other properties which we have associated in the past with beauty, with the eternal feminine, and the experience of beauty, the very purpose of literature, the Dantes, the Shakespeares of the world, that has, as a culture, has sort of evaporated. It's off of our radar, and thus, once again, sort of adds, to the ironic urgency of old things.
Yeah, because they're very desired, I don't mean to be picking, but I mean, but the the very desire to be wanted, right? Especially with my students, and this is something that we pursued for them with these ancient texts, these older texts. I left them. We just finished this past week, and we went into finals this next week, and then they go off to Christmas. But one of the things I left them with was sit with this tension, sit with this conflict. That you have where you think you don't know what to do with poetry. You don't know how to read even Erasmus, and that's troubling, right?
Mm,
You don't know what to do with Dante. You definitely don't know what to do with Plato, or even Augustine. Let's sit with the fact that we had a hard time reading these people because you couldn't stand still. You couldn't give this thing attention, because you didn't. First and foremost, you don't know its place in your life. You don't know that it has a place in your life.
mhm.
So you're not going to devote time to it. This is just a class to take. You have to take my class in order to move forward. But what's even more troubling, and I let them know is if you can't understand the appeal and the pursuit of wooing that you see in Dante, or even to some degree the medieval and modernist humanist bridge of Shakespeare's sonnets, then I looked at these young women's face and I said, I know you don't want to be treated as a swipe left or a swipe right. You don't. I know you don't. My heart as a father doesn't want you. I have a daughter your age. I don't want you to be treated as a thing to be consumed only. And the problem is that you don't see by not being able to be to understand what it means to be pursued in this poetic way, you open yourself up to be left and right, swipe left or swipe right. I mean, I have a story of a student who basically called out a man for mansplaining for helping her with her car, and in that I just did a really nice little pushback. I'm mansplaining to her apparently, but I'm pushing back through literature by saying
Yeah.
maybe it's
It's
a
like
man.
mansplaining
Yeah,
squared. If you
squared.
mansplain
I
a
know you put me in
mansplanation,
a weird.
yeah,
That's what I told
that's
her. I was like, you put me in a weird spot because I'm a man. But what I would do with hat in hand is tell you, maybe you're valued. I did have a young woman who looked at it another way, and she tried to take it from a point of view of saying, I need a man, and I said, no, 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 you need a man to value you above all else. I'm praying for you to have a partner who sees you as such value, they're willing to give their life for you. Not that you need it, but to some degree, God has given you the the right to be loved, the right to be valued, the right to be treated like a Beatrice. That's what I want as a father to a daughter, right? And these are the things that I just feel like, and now I feel an urgency along with you that we're losing, because I don't think deep down inside these young people want to be desired like this. They don't. They don't want to be mechanized. They don't want to be spread thin. They don't want to be shallow. They want to be deep in meaning filled life. And to some degree, even the academy is doing them a disservice by not giving them reasons to love these old stories, right?
right.
Or even giving them the mechanisms to read these old stories.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
and
they're difficult, and I mean, we have a sort of a funny double standard, and I think it's probably our just working in our imaginations, the evolutionary model. We have zero problems if you point out to your students, hey, we have more technology than our ancestors did. Everyone knows that, right? We have more ability to control nature and to turn it into what we wish. Everyone knows that, right? But if you suggested that, but you know what? Our ancestors had technologies for developing not power over nature, but to develop their own interior lives. And they were
mm,
better at that. and these technologies are called classics or the
Yeah, yeah,
great books.
yeah.
There's a sort of funny and funny reluctance to pay our ancestors the that counter compliment that they were better at inwardness, even if
Interesting.
we have sort of advanced powers of you know of of external powers, which I think in moderation are good. I think when they're destructive and dangerous is when those are the only things that we value. And as Lewis said, of course, having conquered nature, then we just conquer ourselves, and thus nature has the last laugh. So I think one of the sort of things that excites me, and maybe this is why I wasn't depressed even when I was writing apocalyptic things in the book, is that both Lewis and his friend Barfield sort of talked about this great age in which the wisdom of the ancients and the accomplishments of the moderns would hopefully be sort of refused again, and that what we have won with great cost as a modern culture could then be tempered and well, I mean, you could almost sort of talk about it as sort of like um, a fruitful union after a long period of estrangement, right? A marriage between antiquity and modernity, and it could result in great fruits again. And that sort of excites me, is that we don't have to pretend that we're not in the age that we live in, and we don't have to reject all of our technologies, but we do want to recover this sense of interiority and the sense of inwardness, and that I think is difficult for us because they thought in different ways, they created in different ways, they hadn't been mechanized, they had a sort of attentiveness. The very mode in which their imaginations work is less linear than ours. But I think if we can come with a sense of piety, if we can come with a sense of reverence and patience, then I think we can have this kind of fruitful union again of modernity and antiquity, and hopefully bring some of the goods of our external accomplishments with their own deep sense of interiority and inwardness.
Great. Well, that's a great way to end this. A renewal, and how
A renewal
exciting
that
it
comes
is.
by marriage.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was so
Yeah.
just thinking of the whole marriage thing. I sometimes tell my students that the goal of a marriage is for a man to acquire all of the virtues of a woman without losing his primal sense of masculinity, and vice versa. That
Mm,
ultimately, I think, to be complete humans, we need a full set of virtues. And what we're saying, I suppose, is a little bit unpopular to think that there's even, you know, there are even sort of starting points for men and women. But I do believe that, but I also believe that's part of the beauty of the complementarity, is that we can sort of we can teach each other how to become more successful and more full humans by sharing these properties which have been given to us by nature, and also to a certain extent by education and training. But I think if we use that sort of marriage, or that sort of wonderful metaphor of marriage, if we're also just sort of thinking chronologically, in which the great ages could be reunited, then I think we could, though in the midst of the apocalypse, also be at the beginning of a golden age.
wow. And there's so much to say about what would that mean to be called the bride of Christ? you know.
No,
Um,
there's the reason these old metaphors haven't died yet, right?
yeah, absolutely. Well,
Yeah.
when does the book come out?
The book comes out today.
Ah, sweet.
Yeah,
December 6th.
December 6th.
When we're making this recording.
That's right.
Amazon, the whole what's next for you? You have another translation. I know me and you are constantly talking about things that are on the horizon for us, but I mean, what do you have next in terms of writing? You have a blog. Why did you decide to do a Substack blog? I'm dating myself. Why do you have a Substack? Why did you feel like that was something that you wanted to
Yeah.
to do?
Um, I think for a lot of reasons. I think one, I wanted a space where I could work out my thoughts. I found that I think, and now that in my senectitude of being 42, I've come to terms with how I write, and what I've realized is that I can't write in a vacuum. I always have to write for a specific audience. I have to write
Mm,
about a specific thing for a specific group of people. And I've tried to like program myself, and I've tried to write the right book for the right market and figure out what the market was, and then sort of reverse engineer it. And I've just realized, probably for the good, I can't do that. I have to write for real people about real things, and sort of forget for a while where it's all going. And so I think that the Substack creates a space for me to be working out these individual thoughts. But also, I think I think it helps me create a platform in which I could talk about, not necessarily, I could talk about the world and not necessarily an academic way. I've spent most of my life talking about good books and great books. I've talked about Dante. I've talked about Lewis. Now, coming up next year, I've got a book on Brothers Karamazov coming out, and I love that, and I don't ever intend to stop doing that. But I think also to begin to sort of make claims about culture and how these things actually can get into our daily lives. That was exciting to me, and so that for me, the Substack seems a way of engaging this other aspect outside of the academy, this cultural element.
Well, what's also, and here's I'm bringing my Baptist to bear. I think also there's also one element, the work that you're doing. There's also an element of, and I would tell people that are listening, the more you work with ancient literature, um, the more things you'll start picking up from the Bible, right? The Bible is comprised of so many genres, especially poetry. It's like 1/3, I think, of the Bible is poetry, which is an ancient text. And the Bible Project people that I listen to all the time say it's a meditative text. I would say going through the process of teaching this last semester has helped me understand even more so how powerful the collected books of the Bible are, and how, even the ancient words being written so many years ago has so much power today, but the power lies in its
Mm,
ability to use language and metaphor and simile and a vocabulary that's deep.
mhm.
And so even, I tell my students, even in understanding and meditating on old text, on ancient text, will help you with the most important text in our life, which is the Bible. So for
Yes.
those of you who are outsiders, say, "What? How's this have any implication for me?" Well, it has implications even on how you read your Bible and how to learn how to read your Bible, which is important. Should be important for all of us. Every
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, so I think you're right. I think in our sort of, again, in our sort of mechanized society, we come to the Bible and say, what does the Bible say? As if we're trying to reduce it to, to axioms and arguments. But I think what you're just reminding us as well is that, look, the very fact that it's written in these different literary styles means that in addition to asking what it says, we need to ask how it says it. And thus, almost sort of, one of the most important things about becoming a good reader of literature is that it would help us in the how and not just the what. I like that. I
Absolutely.
think I agree.
Well, thanks, Jason. I appreciate it. And this won't be the last time when we talk about fun things. Hopefully, the next translation of Divine Comedy will come out, next year or so, right?
Next year.
Oh man, anybody who's listening that's looking for a very accessible, in terms of Divine Comedy, that you want to get in, and everybody should at least try to struggle with Dante at some point in their life. Your Inferno was a godsend, not only as a teacher, but for somebody who just trying to get introduced to that world of Dante and try to figure out why he's important to my life. So I think it's fantastic. So
Well,
thanks
that's
for
great.
coming.
That's why you write the books in the first place, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. So thanks for your hard work, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks.